Hi, my name is Wesley, otherwise known as HeydoubleU, and I'm a freelance 3D artist and animator. This is part 2 in my series on making an animated short from scratch, and in this video I'll be showing you how to rig the character created in part 1. Of course, you could apply the steps in this video to rigging pretty much any character. The first step is to create the character's skeleton. I enter the Create Joints tool, go to the side view, and start with the character's leg. I add a hip, knee, ankle, and toe joint, and then go in the front view and line this up with the leg, and I'm only worrying about the character's left side for now, as I'll mirror the joints over later. Now onto the spine. I'm making a perfectly straight spine, so I stay in the front view for this, but if you wanted to add some curve, you'd obviously need to switch to the side view. I hold X to enable grid snapping when placing the first, and then holding Shift will ensure the next joint is in the same direction as the last. Since this character doesn't have a neck, I only create one joint there, but if it was a character with a neck, you'd want at least two. Onto the arm, I start with the clavicle, then the shoulder, then the rest of the joints, and it's common to skip the clav and go straight from the spine to the shoulder, but this is generally a big mistake as shoulders actually have a lot of range of movement, and by skipping this joint, you really limit that for your character. I also add this joint between the elbow and the wrist. This is to help when twisting the wrist. The idea is by spreading the rotation over several joints, you can go much further before having to worry about any pinching. Usually one is enough, but the more joints, the more you can push it. So I'm only adding this to the forearms, but you'll see these used on biceps, obviously legs, and of course all kinds of non-humanoid characters. With how simple the hand is, I make these 3 joint finger bones. Of course, normally fingers would be made up of 4 joints. And I forgot to add this initially, but I go back and add a hand joint for all the fingers to connect to. With all the joints placed for one side, I'm ready to mirror them, although at this point you'd want to rename them so you don't have to rename both sides. Use whatever naming convention you want. I usually use the format of the joint name, the side it's on, and then the word joint. For example, ankle_L_joint. Once finished, I'll go to Skeleton and Mirror Joints tool options. I want to make sure I'm mirroring the right direction. I prefer to mirror behavior instead of orientation, and then I can use the search and replace to replace L with R since this is going to be the right side. Now I parent the limbs to the spine. I also make some final adjustments to the skeleton, adjusting the positions of some bones. I also decide to add an extra joint to the spine. Now I'm ready to bind the skin to the skeleton. I do this by selecting the root bone, the mesh, and then going to skin and bind skin. And I leave all the settings to their default as I'm going to completely redo the skin weights anyway. You can still get decent results by tweaking the skinning settings and then making fixes here and there. I usually find though, unless I'm tight on time, that just starting from scratch gives me the best results. I right-click the mesh to enter the paint weights tool, and then I flood the root with a value of 1. The idea here is I'm starting at the top of the joint hierarchy, and then I'm going to work my way down each chain of bones, as opposed to, for example, starting at the hand and trying to work your way up the arm. Starting at the thigh, I just paint the area of influence that I think this joint should have, and then holding Shift, I just smooth this out until the deformations look good. Another technique I want to mention that I won't be using here but can really improve your skinning is corrective blend shapes. The idea is you create blend shapes that fade in and out as your character reaches certain positions, and these can be used to help better preserve volume, create muscle bulges, or whatever other effects you're going for. And Maya has a tool called the Pose Editor, which is specifically made for setting these up. Onto the knee, I start out again by painting where I know I want the knee to have full influence, then I set the value to roughly 0.5 and paint this edge loop around the knee. For the ankle, I just go full influence for the whole foot, and I don't even worry about anything in between. Onto the toe, I pretty much do the same thing. Onto the spine, a thick character like this is pretty straightforward. I just paint everything above with a value of 1, and then create this smooth transition. The clav and shoulder can be a little bit tricky to get right, but it's the same idea, painting the area with a value of 1 and then smoothing it out. I notice here the thumb is rotated out of place. I must have done this on accident when opposing other joints. If this ever happens though, you can just select the root joint and go to skin and go to bind pose. I do the elbow just like I did the knee, and then for the twist joint, I'll approach it just like every other joint, although I want to really smooth it out and spread the twist over the whole forearm. For the wrist, I just paint the whole hand with a value of 1, then I switch the paint operation to smooth and press flood to just smooth out that border a little bit. Hands can be pretty tricky, although I approach it pretty much the same way as every other joint. Another trick you can use is after getting some rough weights painted, posing the hand and then switching the brush to add and setting the value to something very low. And then you can nudge the weights from one joint to the other just by clicking several times. Once finished painting weights, I'll go to skin and open the mirror skin weights options. I just want to make sure I'm mirroring in the right direction and the other default settings are fine. Now I'm ready to rig up the controls. I skipped ahead making these as it's not too complicated and it mostly comes down to personal preference, but the process is to make the controller look however looks good to you, put it in position, and then freeze transforms. So you'll notice all of these are zeroed out completely. And as far as deciding what controls to make and where to put them, I'll explain each of these as I go. Lastly, off-axis controls like the thumb here, you want to set these up a little differently, so I've skipped them for now. I want to mention while you can create all these controls by hand, there's tons of tools out there to speed up the process. For example, this script I use called Create Control Curve UI, which you can use to create curve presets, color them, and a few other things. So in most cases, there's one of 3 ways you'll rig up a chain of joints. The first is FK, which is the most intuitive, and it consists of basically just parenting the joint to a controller. The second is IK, which drives the whole joint chain with the position of just a single controller. This can make it really easy to get certain poses, but it's also harder to animate arcing motions since it's controlled by the position of something and not the rotation. The third is spline IK, in which the joint chain will try to follow a curve. This is good for tails, spines, anything with a lot of joints in it. I generally lean towards using IK most of the time as the fewer controls make animation faster, but you'll usually see rigs with a mix of both and also have switches that let you switch from one to the other. So with that, I'll start out by creating a spline IK for the spine. This can be done under the skeleton menu. This is also where you create normal IK handles, so I'll just pop this menu out for now. So once the tool is active, I'll click on the root followed by the neck to create the spline, and you'll see I have this new curve object here. This is what controls the spine now. I'll go to curves and rebuild to add a few extra points as the default 4 isn't quite enough. Then I'll grab the top half and create a cluster. This creates a transform which these points are essentially parented to. I'll then do the same for the bottom half. And now I have these 2 clusters for my 2 spline controllers. I'll create a parent constraint for the clusters to their respective controllers, and then I'll parent both of those to this larger root controller. So now I can move the whole thing, but I can also move just the hips or just the chest. But I can't twist the controllers. This is because the curve only knows the position of its points and not the rotation. The IK handle itself though has these twist and roll attributes just for this. So I'll add the chest controller and the root controller to the graph and then just hook up their Y rotations. And all looks well, but I'm not quite done. You can see if I push the rotation to some extreme angle, then some weird behavior starts to happen. This has to do with the rotation order. You can see if I switch to gimbal and start to rotate this, eventually the y-axis will become misaligned with what would be the twisting motion. So to fix this, I just need to switch both controllers' rotation order from XYZ to YZX. Now onto the leg, I'll start with the Create IK Handle tool, clicking the hip and then the ankle. Now I want to attach this to the foot control, but I don't want to parent it directly. Instead, I'll select the IK handle, press Ctrl G to put it in a group, and I'll parent constraint this to the foot control. Next, I'll select this control in front of the knee and then the IK handle, and I'll create a pull vector constraint. This will have the knee always facing wherever this controller is. And I'll parent this to the foot controller so I can move it all as one. For the ankle, I want to add a foot roll control. This will help with walk cycles and getting good foot contact. With nothing selected, I'll press Ctrl G. This will make just an empty group, and I'll enable display handle to help show what's going on better. I'll rename this to heel pivot and then duplicate it and rename the duplicate to toe pivot. I'll then parent the toe to the heel and place these accordingly. I'll delete the parent constraint on the IK handle. I want to instead constrain this to the toe pivot. I also want to parent constraint the ankle joint, but only the rotation. Now if I rotate the pivots, you can see the effect this is having. I'll parent them to the master foot control, and rotating both these individually is not too practical, so I'll hook them up to a single attribute. So with the foot control selected, I'll control right click in the channel box, go to add attribute, and create an attribute called foot roll. Then I'll go to Window, Animation Editors, and open the Expression Editor. Here I can create a simple expression that'll drive this. Here I'll say if the foot roll attribute is greater than 0, basically if it's a positive number, I want to set the toe pivot rotation equal to the foot roll. Then for good measure, I'll add another line setting the heel rotation equal to 0. Now I'll copy paste this to the else section, and I just want the reverse of this, setting the heel equal to the foot roll and the toe to 0. Now I can click create, and assuming I didn't mistype anything or miss any semicolons, I should have a nice foot roll. For the toe control, I'll select it, then the toe joint, and create a parent constraint, again only constraining the rotation. Then I'll parent this to the heel pivot, as I want it to move with the heel, but I want it to stay put when rolling on the toe. And now everything's working correctly, although at this moment I realize the toe pivot is slightly misplaced. This should be lined up with the toe joint, so I take a minute to reposition it and update the constraints. Now onto the arm. To start, the process will be just like the leg. I'll take a moment to mention if when creating IK handles or pull vectors you see unexpected behavior like the elbow rotating in the wrong direction or flipping. To fix this, before creating the IK handle, you just need to give the elbow a slight rotation and then right click and set preferred angle. This will inform the solver of which direction you want it to rotate in and should solve all these problems. So after setting up the arm IK just like the leg, I'll parent both the arm control and pull vector control to the shoulder control. And I like this setup as it's kind of a hybrid between an FK arm and an IK arm. I also want to be able to move this, so I'll parent the shoulder joint to this, but only the translates as the rotation is driven by the IK handle. For the clav control, I'll simply just parent constrain the clav joint to this controller, and then I could parent the shoulder control to this, but this setup isn't exactly ideal. Instead, I'll group the shoulder controller to itself, move the pivot of this group to the shoulder, and then parent constraint just the translates to the clav controller. And this gives me this setup where the clav moves the arm in the right position, but keeps the rotation of the shoulder controller. I'll rig up the wrist controller just by parent constraining just the rotation of the wrist joint. And of course I want to involve the twist joint. So to do this, I'll just connect the X rotation of the controller to the X rotation of the joint. And then I'll also put in a unit conversion and set it to 0.5. So the rotation of the twist joint will always be half of the wrist control as it's the in-between point. I'll rig up the finger joints to the finger controls simply with parent constraints. Then parent the fingertip control to the finger base, and then this to the wrist. Now I don't want to parent the wrist to the arm controller to avoid unwanted stretching. Instead, I'll group the wrist controller to itself, and then parent constrain this group to the elbow joint. I'll duplicate the finger controls to make the thumb controls, but I don't want to just rotate these into place, as then I'll have to freeze transforms and it will no longer be aligned with the thumb. Now you could go with this and it would technically work fine, but a better option is to instead group the controls to themselves and rotate this group into position. This way the controls inside will be oriented along with the group, but they'll maintain the zero transforms. After getting these into position and adjusting the shape to better fit the thumb, I'll create the constraints and parent this to the wrist just like I did with the other finger. Now with everything correctly rigged up, I'll grab the controls for one side, press the up arrow a few times. This will transfer the selection to the top of the hierarchy. I'll then group this, duplicate this group, and then set its scale X to -1. This makes a mirrored set of controls, not only in their position, but also their behavior. For example, if I grab both arm controls and move one, the other will mirror it. A quick note, I have my transform tool axis set to object. If I set it to world, it will override this behavior. I want to change all these control colors as I like to use blue to represent left controllers and red to represent right. I can do this for all of them by selecting them, pressing the down arrow to shift the selection to their shape node. Then with the attribute spreadsheet, I'll locate the override color and set it to 13, which is the color index for red. I also need to make sure enable overrides is on, but I know this is the case as I already colored these blue. Now it's just a matter of repeating the rigging steps for these right controllers. Unfortunately, there's no quick way to mirror entire rigging. It's possible, but it's a lot to take in if it's your first time rigging, so this is probably the simplest solution. Once the body's finished, I can move on to the head, and starting with the eyes, I'll first make this 2D slider controller. I'm holding X when placing these points, as I want to make this exactly 2 by 2. I'll then duplicate it and scale it inwards. The exact size doesn't matter, but the idea here is that the small square is the controller, and the large one is a visual representation of the bounds. And the reason for making it exactly 2 by 2 is then the controller will range from +1 to -1 on both X and Y. I'll make sure to freeze transforms, and then I'll parent the control curve to the bounds curve. As I mentioned though, this is just a visual, so to actually set up these bounds, I need to select the controller, go to the attribute editor, and enable limit information on all the translates. I'll set the X and Y between -1 and 1, and the Z to 0, 0, which basically just locks that attribute. Now I can freely position and scale the bounds curve, and the control inside will be nonetheless bound to it. Now with the controller ready, I'll work on rigging the eyes. Of course, rigging these to simply translate around won't look very good, so I'll use a few deformers to nicely wrap this to the head. I'll start by creating this plane and roughly scaling it and positioning it over the eyes. I'll also adjust the subdivision some. I'll delete history, freeze transforms, and then mirror this to the other side. I also assign this a blue material just to make it easier to see. I'll then select the plane followed by the head mesh and create a shrink wrap deformer. And as the name implies, wherever I move this plane, it'll be shrink wrapped to the head. I want to make sure the direction is along the vector normals, and it's a little jagged because of the low poly underlying mesh, so I'll increase the smoothing a little bit. If I move these too far, it starts to come off the head, so I'll select both eye planes, then the head mesh, and go to Modify Match Pivots. That way the pivots for these will be at the center of the head, and I can rotate them now to move it around. And then I'll select an eye, its respective plane, and create a wrap deformer. So the eye is wrapped to the plane, which is shrink wrapped to the head. And the effect of this is wherever I move the plane, the eye will follow, and it will perfectly adhere to the underlying head mesh. I notice if I go too far it starts to break. I just need to enable bidirectional on the shrink wrap deformers. I really like the freedom of motion this rigging allows, but the eye controller I set up earlier is pretty limiting. So I'm going to set up 2 sets of eye controls, one for speed and the other for freedom of motion. I'll start by creating circles for my new set of eye controls. I'll then also align these eye control pivots to the head, and then parent constraint the eye planes to their eye controller. And these now have the effect of what rotating the plane itself did. I'll select both controllers and press Ctrl G to group them. I'll then align this group's pivot to the head as well. Now I can control each eye individually, but rotating this group moves the eyes together as a whole. And this is what I'll rig up to the 2D controller I made earlier. Adding the eye controller and eye control group to the node editor, I'll plug the translate X into the rotate Y and the translate Y into the rotate X. And moving the controller around, I notice it's pretty subtle, and also the Y is flipped. I'll edit these unit conversion nodes to fix this. You can set these values as high or as low as you want, depending on how sensitive you want to make the control. I think a value of 0.5 is pretty good, and I'll set the Y to -0.5 again to flip it. And for one last minute addition, I'll select the individual eye control and the eye plane and create a scale constraint. And now I can control this by scaling these as well. I'll also hide the eye planes as they're just there for rigging and shouldn't be visible. I'm going to create really simple mouth rigging by just making blend shapes and hooking them up to sliders. It doesn't make for a very robust rig, but this is how I like to work on my own shorts, as it's super quick to set up. And if while I'm animating I run into a situation where the character can't make a certain face, I can always just edit the rig and add in that new blend shape at that time. I'll open the shape editor, select the head, and then create a blend shape. And then as I mentioned, this process is very simple. I'm just going to create targets for all of the various expressions I want to have. I do most of these with soft select and mirroring on. Of course, you could use the sculpting tools or anything else that gets the vertices in the position you want. A good set of expressions to pretty much always have, and the ones I'm making here, are mouth wide, narrow, open, and then smile and frown. And like I said, I'm doing all of these mirrored, but if you wanted to, for example, have separate left smile, right smile blend shapes, you wouldn't need to do each side individually. Just do one, and then you can right click a target and do things like duplicate, mirror, flip, etc. I also create a set of blend shapes to translate the mouth left and right and up and down, although I only need two, one pushing the mouth to the side and one pushing the mouth up, and then I can use negative weights to push it in the other direction. I make expressions for the eyes by putting blend shapes on the underlying eye plane, although I don't end up using these in the animation, so I won't go too into detail, but the process is exactly the same as the mouth. I'll duplicate the eye controls to make the various mouth controllers, although I may have to make some modifications. For example, this first one I'm going to use for the width of the mouth and opening and closing it, but the mouth resting position is closed, so I don't need to be able to move this controller up. So I'll go to the limit information settings and set the Y max to 0. I'll then modify this curve to reflect the new bounds. I'll be connecting the controllers to the various blend shapes using set-driven keys. You can think of these as special keyframes, but whereas normal keyframes, the driving variable is time, in the case of set-driven keys, the driving variable is some attribute. For example, in this case, it'll be the position of some controller. That being said, these use the same interpolation as normal keyframes, so I'm going to go to my animation settings and set default tangent to linear. Now I'll select the mouth control and load it as the driver, and then I'll select the mouth blend shape and load it as the driven. I'll select the translate Y and the open blend shape and create the first key. Then I'll move the controller down, set the open blend shape to 1 and create another. Now making sure the control is back to 0, I'll switch to the translate X, and as I mentioned, this is going to control the wide and narrow, so I'll select both blend shapes and create another key. Then I'll move the controller all the way to the left and set narrow to 1 and create a key. Then I'll move it to the right, set wide to 1 and create another key. I can now rig up all the blend shapes using this exact same process. Some will only need 1D sliders, for example the smile and frown, in which case it's even easier. Here I'll limit the information to only allow it to move along the Y-axis. Once finished making the controls, I reorganized them a little bit. I usually like to do one side for the mouth and one side for the eyes. So on the left I have the mouth controls, and on the right I have the eye controls. I also made these little X curves and parented all the controls to them, so I could reposition these as like control panels if I needed to. Now I don't want to be able to accidentally select any of the bound curves when animating, so I'll select all of them, open up the attribute spreadsheet, and enable template. Now they'll still be visible, but they won't be selectable. Now I want to rig everything up to this master head controller. I'll select all these controls I made, including the hidden eye planes, and I'll parent them to this head controller. Now I'll select the head mesh, the eyes, and the hat and put them in a group. And I could parent this group directly to the head controller, although it's a little ugly as selecting the head controller now highlights all these meshes. So instead I'll parent constrain the group to the head controller, which has the same effect but doesn't highlight the meshes. I'll also create a scale constraint for this group in case I ever need to rescale the head for some reason. Now I want to get this master control working, so I'll select everything but the body mesh and the head mesh group and parent it, and now I can freely move and rescale the entire character. Luckily this is a pretty simple character and parenting everything works fine, although I will mention with more complicated rigs, getting a master control to work like this can be sometimes a little more complicated. Now some last minute cleanup. I'll select everything in the outliner, press Ctrl G, and rename this to just rig. I'll then select the skeleton, the clusters, IK handles, basically anything I don't want to see. I'll group this together, call this group rigging, and then hide this. I'll now select the controls and put them on a display layer and call this control layer. I usually like to also give this a color, just keep in mind any uncolored curves will inherit this color. I'll disable this P flag, which is visibility during playback, so you can see the controls when posing your character, but they auto hide when you playback. I'll select the body and head mesh group and create another display layer for it. On this one I want to set the right mouse button to R, which stands for reference, so I'll still be able to see the mesh, but I won't be able to select it. One more bit of polish you can add to your rig is locking and hiding the attributes that aren't relevant to a given controller. For example, on this chest control, you'll see the scale and visibility attributes aren't there. As for the mouth control, I've only left the translate X and Y visible. To do this, select whatever channels you don't want, right click and select lock and hide selected. So by this point, you'll have a fully rigged character ready for animation. This concludes part 2. Thank you for watching, and feel free to subscribe to the NVIDIA Studio YouTube channel for more videos like this.